Hi, everybody. Can you guys hear me back there? Yep. Before I get started, how many people here have had to take over an abandoned code base? Whether it's open source or in your own work, had to start working on code that wasn't yours? Awesome. It can be a daunting process, it can be frustrating, it can make you want to kill other programmers, and hopefully this talk will help alleviate some of that. So, I'm Greg, and I'm usually pretty bad at introductions, and today isn't any different, so that's my introduction. One thing I want to say is I really love this group. I was up here in the earlier part of the year, January, February, and it was just really good questions, really good discussions, and at the time I was in New York, I'm now in New Haven, and you know, I would definitely come up here as much as possible to see this group. So I'm really happy to be here, and if you have questions during this talk, because I know from the last time I talked here, people have really good feedback, just let me know, just during the talk. And I definitely want to hear from some of the people. It seems like most of the room is dealing with someone else's code that's bothering them. So I'd like to hear from you as well. So I usually use the Kodahashi method, which is basically the Takahashi method, 6 words or less or so on a slide. And then I normally throw in 20 plus lines of code on like every other slide. And as usual, ridiculous amount of slides. There's 93 in this talk. I plan to get through them in about 25 minutes, 30 minutes. This time I got lazy, and I've actually been getting lazy kind of intentionally every other talk, where I do a non-technical talk. Because I think one of the things that is really important, that's kind of underestimated how important it is how we deal with software practices. And this isn't just big words like agile software development and things like that, but just kind of how we think about the things that we're doing day to day. So this talks a little bit more about that kind of stuff. I did write some software to do this presentation, and you're looking at the actual usage of it, and this is what I used to write my slideshow here, which explains why it's very Spartan. It was implemented with Report via PDF Writer, so that's like the second part of my introduction. PDF Writer, people may have thought it was a dead project, but it's not anymore. And that's mostly thanks to the wonder of TDD, which of course is talk-driven development. So the first thing that you have to do in talk-driven development is pitch a talk, and then actually learn how to talk about what you're going to. And then write bad presentation software the night before, at 4:30 in the morning. Give the talk, cross your fingers, and start back at the beginning. It's really just a rendering refactor process that you have to know. Seriously though, PDF Writer is an important project. It's been abandoned for over 2 years, but it's basically our PDF solution we're using. And it's also a core component for Report, which means that I have to deal with it on a day-to-day basis. Been abandoned for 2 years, which is a long time. In those 2 years, we end up with plenty of bug reports just dead in the tracker. Things like, oh, it'll be in the next release in a couple of days, date 2005. And lots of people get pissed off because of that. People get very frustrated when you don't get a response, or you get a response that's sort of a hand-wavy kind of, oh yeah, I'll fix it, and then nothing happens. And when I talked at Ruby East, when I talked about Report, people have actually asked about us thinking about removing PDF Writer from Report and working with another solution, because someone said PDF Writer sucks. Well, the truth is, pretty much all abandoned software sucks. And the reason is there's no one to get mad at. So, why don't you take over our project? Well, I started getting things in here, and hopefully you can see this. This is a memory patch. That's from Report. It's still in the code base if you're using Report right now. And this one is one that actually fixes a bug in the way that PDF simple table orders things. And that stuff was really making me pissed off at myself. And users were getting mad at us for PDF writer bugs. So we had all the headaches of maintaining a project with none of the fun. So at that point, you think, why not take over a project? If there's no one else there, I mean, what's the worst that could happen? Well, a lot of us are too busy. I don't think, does anyone here have a ridiculous amount of free time that they can do anything? Because if you do, I mean, we're looking for contributors. I do. And if you think about it, is it too much work to jump into a new project, especially something that you didn't start out? And we're not talking about stuff that you have to. Oh, this is a good time to ask. How many of you who raised your hands, are we talking about an open source project that you abandoned? Or that you picked up that was abandoned, rather? Yeah. So you're all doing it because you have to. And it is a lot of work. But the question is, at what point is the amount of workarounds and the problems that you're dealing with, going to be more than the amount of work that you have to put into an abandoned open source project that you're using, that you're relying on? And in our case, it seemed like we were getting to that point. And you ask yourself whether or not it's too much responsibility. I mean, you're basically jumping into someone else's shoes, and if the project is popular, that could be pretty daunting. But something's usually better than nothing. And if you stick to the basics, it's not too bad. I mean, first of all, there's going to be some broken stuff that annoys you. How many people here have at least one thing that annoys them about an open source project that they use? Yeah. Some people don't. Maybe you don't use open source. But there's also broken stuff that annoys other people, and maybe they've offered fixes, and maybe someday they'll be your annoys as well. There's also cool features that are waiting to be implemented, and if you go through pretty much any feature request list for any project, you'll see stuff that just sounds really awesome, but never gets done. And finally, there's people that are waiting out there to help out. They're just waiting for someone to answer their emails, waiting for them to apply their patches. That's what's really beautiful about a project that's already got past its 1.0 stage in open source. There's people who want to help but don't want to take over the project. With someone there, you can help them actually contribute. So the approach that we're taking now with PDF writers, we're starting from the outside and just working in. Because any code that isn't yours is clearly correct. So the key is to own the code that you're working with. And you can start by picking a problem that annoys you, some bad code that obviously you could have done better. And write a test, or in the case of PDF Writer, this is something, does anyone have any experience of dealing with things that are extremely difficult to test? Because I would love to talk to you about how we can automate our testing process with PDFs. So catch me afterwards, or something like that. But write a test or an example that exposes a problem if you're working on a new code base. And your test clearly doesn't suck because you wrote it. So you fix the sucky broken implementation. And the key is that you start using that fix in your real projects. And now you've got something, you've got some profit. This may be just a private patch, but we're working up to the idea of actually owning this project. And then once you start using it and you realize there's problems, fix your test. And then just keep doing this over and over for a large amount of times. And as you do this, you can measure your progress. Now, if you're lucky enough to have your tests that are already there, you can use something like Archive. I'm not going into too much detail, but this is basically something that when your tests run, it shows what code's actually being run. It says absolutely nothing about your test quality, but if you've got red zones, then you know for sure that that code isn't being tested. And that's a good place to start to look for bugs, and to, whenever you have a problem, it's just kind of pointing you in the obvious red zone direction. Now, Heckle is kind of an interesting tool that, again, trying to keep it non-technical, but this is something that allows you to take your tests and it morphs the original code so that the test should fail. The worst thing that you can have is coming into a new project that you're not familiar with, reading your tests because that's, in a sense, your roadmap to the project, and then having those tests lying to you, having them testing something that isn't actually what it says it's testing, having tests that are incomplete, missing edge cases, and things like that. So you can actually automate this, and this is a good way to go and beat up a test suite and see if you can find some problems. And you might find that that causes a lot of the bug reports and things like that, that seemingly were a mystery to start to fall away, because you can find the sources of the problems. And another thing that's interesting is if you're going into a pretty big code base, is you should at least look at your performance. Ruby has some stuff built in, and then RubyProf is an excellent profiling tool. And that's really the next step for us. We've gone through the stages of killing a bunch of bugs, fixing our own problems. We want to make sure that the things that we're introducing into PDF Writer don't make it slower than it already is, because it's really slow. So the question is, when you're working on code that isn't yours, have you destroyed performance? Maybe you refactored code that looked ugly to you. This is very common, and this has happened a lot of times with patches that apply to Rootport, where we have to go through, and something looks really good at the time. Someone takes a method that looked really convoluted, makes it really beautiful and nice, and you go and find out that they've changed something by an order of magnitude, and now PDFs just won't generate or something like that. That's not so good. So especially when you're working on code that you don't understand, keep an eye on the performance. And I mean, this is really simple. It doesn't need to be formal benchmarks per se. Just when you're building a new feature or fixing things, write something that can track it so you can keep an eye on it. And then if you have the time and the ability to really make a comprehensive bench suite, then you'll be in the best case at all. So all of these things about code quality and things like that are all important questions while you're starting to dive into a project. But if it's in the case of open source code, you have more to worry about. And this is really just part of the picture. If you're dealing with an interesting project that has had a lot of users, you have a community to deal with, and you're now inheriting that. And you want to have the ability to take the project in the direction that you want to. That's one of the profits of becoming a developer on a project that has been abandoned. But you don't want to scare away the community that's basically been lying dormant and leave yourself alone with a bunch of code that you don't really fully understand. So with PDF Writer, we've been working on establishing development practices that kind of fit what we've been doing with some of our other projects, because basically, Mike Milner and myself are lead developers for Ruby reports, and we're now also lead developers on PDF Writer. So the first thing that we did is we migrated all of the bug tracking and things like that over to Track, because that's the development system that is most comfortable for us to work with. And what I'm stressing here is, say a project had some practices that worked for that developer, and people kind of got used to that, but maybe they weren't happy with it. And then that person disappears for a couple of years. There's nothing that says that you have to continue following those conventions. And I encourage you to go down the path that is comfortable for you, and then when people complain, start to figure out how you're going to deal with that. But I mean, we switched over to Track, and people are already using it, setting up accounts, things like that, and it really was no problem for us. We're now away from the RubyForge bug tracker, which makes me very happy. It also, for us, meant introducing some sort of release schedule that made sense. We have this kind of almost non-standard, but it's consistent. That's the only thing that's important with release schedules that's consistent, is that whenever we take the third digit and then increment it, it means that we're fixing some sort of bug. That's the only thing that we do when we do that. And then the second digit is major releases. And then the third digit, we have crazy parties when we increment that. So, at that point, this is just really basic stuff that you do to sort of establish how the project's going to work. It gives you a way of communicating with your users. This also goes into, this is release scheduling, but this also goes into how you structure if you're using revision control, which basically every open source project, every project I would say, should be using some sort of revision control. This goes into how you should structure branches. When we first walked into PDF Writer, the trunk had a bunch of partially implemented code in it, which, if you're working on it as a one developer, especially if you're thinking, I don't know if I'll ever release this code, you start to have free range with trunk, fine. But that's been moved off now that we've resumed development on it into an experimental branch. we took the latest stable release, and we copied that over to Trunk, giving us kind of a fresh area to start with. And then we can kind of go and cherry pick patches from the experimental stuff when we understand the code base better. And this is just really a way for you to keep a certain level of stability in the project. I mean, you don't want your first release working on some project, that you took over to absolutely break and just annoy everybody. So, I mean, again, just pick the thing that, works for you. Don't worry too much about the other project conventions, unless they are the ones that already work for you. But I mean, don't be really crazy. I mean, one crazy thing that some people do is insist, and the really good Ruby developers that shall remain nameless, insist that you use Perforce to work on your projects, and if you're not willing to set up Perforce to work with them, then you just can't submit projects to it. And I think that's kind of crazy. Take whatever your definition of crazy is and apply it, and just don't go overboard. Make sure that the practices with the community that you work with. I mean, with Rootport, we're pretty much already working very closely with PDF Writer. We're already experiencing the API at the lower level than what your average PDF Writer consumer would see, and our practices are actually kind of close to what the PDF writer community might actually benefit from, so we just pretty much adopted the same thing. But had it been a different project, we may not have been that lucky. So, I mean, if you're used to dealing with, some massive code base and then you take over a small project, you might not want to, carry that baggage along with you. Oh yeah, the community also probably knows more than you do when you first get into a project. I mean, unless you've been a patcher for years, and you followed the full development of this project, you need to be able to gain the trust of the people who've been using it most and gain their experience as well. And they're the ones that can really help you go from the guy who took it over and hopefully will make something happen to someone who could actually carry the project on. So at this point, I have a little interlude, and it's because it's kind of hard to make this talk exciting. I think it's an important talk, but it's kind of hard to get all excited about what's basically a bunch of administrative work and a bunch of thinking about how to work with the community and things like that. And I just kind of want to know what's on your minds, either from what you've seen here or what you've been doing in your work and practices that you think would be valuable when working on code that isn't yours. So does anyone?
In the particular case of dead open source projects, how do you decide between taking over an existing dead project that maybe kind of sort of works and has bugs and has design decisions you don't like, versus starting your own that solves the same problem better?
That's a very good question. The PDF writer, or the PDF spec is something like 1,200 pages long, so that made the decision easy for us. But if you have the time and the resources available to do something better, I don't think there's anything wrong with competition, especially when a project is dead. You're not really competing, you're just starting over. I sort of want to caution against just doing that, as your first instinct, because if you think about it, you really need to understand how that other code works to know that you're doing something better. And again, it's the sort of like subtle problems that you run into, like, why does PDF Writer's Unicode support suck so bad? It doesn't exist. Well, there's limitations in Ruby 1.8 that make it really hard. So your solution that's going to make it better, unless you have some really rock solid idea of how we're going to do that, I wouldn't suggest going into it. So I think it's kind of a case-by-case kind of thing. It depends what it is in the scale. I mean, if you've got a lot of time, it could be good. I mean, the Greenfield project is probably going to have a whole lot more freedom. It might be more fun to work on. But you also have to consider people who are already using this stuff. I mean, how many people here have generated PDF with Ruby? Not that many, but I mean, typically it's a pretty big problem. I mean, and PDF Writer is, at this point, the top 25 projects in Ruby or something like that. So, I mean, you've got a lot of users that you have to convince, you know, to jump over to something. A lot of coding around here. So, what else do people think?
How do you evaluate between some of the tools that are out there for bug tracking and mailing lists and all that? You know, it sounded like you said you use Track, Rails uses Track, Kubernetes uses Lighthouse. There's lots of different Google groups. Some people tend to use Ruby for various things. It doesn't seem like there's necessarily a consensus in the community on any of that stuff. Why would you choose some of those tools over others for a particular project?
Oh, well, I use a few of them, and Track pissed me off less than some of the other ones. I mean, it's kind of like how you would choose an editor or anything else. It is, again, it is a little bit more important to think about for the project. You know, there's a difference. For some of my commercial work, I end up using Basecamp as sort of like a bug tracker, which is pretty much an awful thing to do. But if you're dealing with clients that can handle that, you know, sometimes it works.
If I can just make a recommendation, if you haven't checked out Redmine yet, you really should. It's pretty much like Track, but it's written in Rails, and it has lots of improvements. It rocks. If you like Track and you like it even better, it's like Track but much better in Rails, so you can build on.
Yeah, I would really, I'll definitely check it out, because having something that's in Ruby, you know, is going to be good for, you know, people contributing things.
Yeah,
But
Sometimes
there's also retrospective, which is also written in Rails.
retrospective,
Yeah, I use retrospective and it contributes patches to it. It's pretty good, but it's, I don't know, it's a little frustrating. They do a lot of things kind of custom, but it's a Rails project, so you can hop right in and find, you know, edit it.
I
so,
think one thing there is sometimes it's an issue of practicality, especially on an open source project. I've seen projects that are trying to get people to take over, and you know, with Track you need to host it yourself, and if it's an open source project, then those hosting resources have to come from somewhere. So they went to Google Code, and if you've used Google Code, it's not ideal.
but it works, and it probably works better than Ruby for
Yeah.
this tracker. Yeah, I mean, I did a full-scale talk on this, and it's online, and I'll put a link on my blog, I guess, about it, but about how to choose your tools and, you know, how to think about those kind of things. But I mean, really, this is in the context of an abandoned project, right? And this is a project that, if you do have contributors to it, they're probably non-dormant. So really, what you're looking for is whatever's going to make you happy, because you're going to be annoyed enough trying to fix bugs that you can create. You know, trying to make yourself happy, and definitely pick something that's practical for your community. So, what are other people's experiences? It doesn't necessarily have to be questions. I would kind of like to hear stories about people's experiences working with other people's code, maybe interesting things they did to try to get their hands around it, or if you do have questions, if you have anything to as well.
I kind of have this problem of being an overambitious patcher. And I've tried to submit patches to Radiant in particular, like a number of times. I like rebuilt Radiant myself different ways. And I always run into walls where I'm trying to do too much, and you know, it's just not acceptable to the core, and then it just gets abandoned and I forget about it. How do you have experience with that in your open source project, or like advice for ambitious patchers?
We did a lot of that with Rupert, actually. Not a lot, but enough where I know what you're talking about. And I don't know, I think you have to kind of make a case for what you're putting in there. I mean, you have to think about, as a contributor, and this is also something that relates to this whole taking over a project versus helping out with a project. As a contributor, your only responsibility is to offer some gift to developers, and if they like it, great. If they don't, well, maybe you can complain on the blog, and maybe someone will complain with you, and then maybe it'll get, you know, implemented, maybe not. Maybe the project will fork in the worst case. But, you know, as a developer, when I'm evaluating patches, I think, is this patch going to cause me more problems than it's going to help me? So if a patch is poorly tested, if it implements features that are going to introduce problems into the software, you know, or if I'm just really not sure what the value of it is, then I've rejected patches before. I always try really, really hard to work with the person, especially if it's one of those things where I really like the idea, but maybe they need to refactor something before it makes sense. Maybe they're doing something right. But yeah, I mean, at that point, developers reserve the right to, reject patches. If you're ambitious, I'm thinking maybe you're interested in bridging from the project. And if there's so much so that you've rebuilt Radiant, I think there's nothing wrong with forking the project. That might be controversial to some extent, but make your own version of Radiant.
But then I have to maintain it. I have to go through all years.
You don't have to.
Well, there's no value, but
Yeah, I mean, make your own version or fight with them so that you can get a suitable extension system. Nothing wrong with it.
well, actually, I'm fighting with them to change the core so that I can do things in my extensions. So
Yeah,
it's
that gets
it's
really
not
tricky.
immediately apparent what I want to do in my extension because they have to explain like
Now let's think
this
about
like
this.
chain of dependency things, you know?
This all does relate back to this topic in sort of a roundabout kind of way, but let's think about this. If you don't know exactly why that core is the way that it is, then your changes to the core are only in the interest of what you're trying to do.
Right.
Which means that this goes back to what I was saying about how you might be creating massive problems on the other end of that. And it's not because they don't like your feature, but they don't like the idea of having to go and change 5 modules to, implement some feature that you want. But sometimes that's a sign of there being a problem. Maybe the core is too brittle, and maybe you can help them make it extensible, and that would be a way to get what everyone wants. Make everyone happy.
I guess this isn't really much of a question, but the problem that I've had more often than seeing dead projects is projects that are kind of half abandoned.
Oh yeah, that's the people right over 2 years.
Where it's like the project definitely has a maintainer and there's development going on, although really slowly, but not in, the development is slow enough that bugs aren't getting fixed and patches aren't getting accepted, but fast enough that it feels wrong to try and, you can't take over the project, it feels wrong to try and port it,
Yeah, that's really hard. That becomes a question of your own personal ethical beliefs and stuff. Yeah. I mean, it becomes whether or not you think that your changes are more important than defining the community. And these are the hard problems we deal with. With enough pressure, everyone comes around, or it becomes apparent that someone's being unreasonable. And I'm not suggesting that you denounce someone because they're going too slow, but if you annoy someone enough, it's going to become apparent where the source of the problem is. So, I have a couple more things to say to that.
I have a general question about cleaning up the project. Imagine a project that, a crowd of Java and .NET developers started to develop Ruby and Java Start. So, and then you have a kind of really messy project, which is basically following the principles of Java but writing it in Ruby code. How would you go and clean up such a project to make it more, the way it's supposed to be if you develop in Ruby and want to create a great project?
Assuming you're not going to rewrite it from the ground up.
Yeah, they continue to add new features because they have clients and they're requesting new features, so they keep developing on it. So, but you also want to make it more maintainable.
Sure. Method by method with lots of tests. You start from the outside and start working on something, whatever you're dealing with on a day-to-day, whatever that's annoying you. I mean, what I do a lot of times is, before I extend anything, I go and I harden it. If there's any bug reports against a module that I haven't fixed yet, a class, whatever, it was some small organization code, I fix those before I do any forward development. I fix those before I refactor, and I write tests for it. Because then you've got a safety net there. And if you do that iteratively, over time, you can migrate a project. I mean, we actually, this is like almost minor, but we've been migrating a lot of the report-related stuff, both from report utility and report, over to more like BDD style stuff we mentioned, I'll bring the report over to RSpec. And not because we're not writing tests in BDD style, but because we think it would be easier for the user. But it's really slow. I mean, that's not something that you want to do in this real time. So I guess you just take it whenever something annoys you, that's normally a code smell of things, and you can start working on it. Does that deal with your question, or are you?
Yeah, no, it was just a question in general, how you would handle such a project. I mean, because, for example, they also like had a test coverage when I first graduated to run ARCOV like 10% or something like that. And then you actually really have to go create some tests, and then if you refactor something, you see if the test breaks, if the old functionality is still there with the new code.
Well, you end up with a situation between important problems and urgent problems. And if something's working, to some definition of working, it's very rare that it's urgent to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
But it may be really important for things like maintainability and things like that. And that's where, take care of the urgent stuff first. Fix the problems and then go into that. I mean, because one, who cares if code's ugly that you're not using? If you're not using it, then it doesn't matter. And if code is working, the fact that it's ugly it's more like you're paying for that over time. And you fix it when it becomes a problem. I mean, that's kind of how I go with it. There's some people are a little bit more aggressive, but I kind of work that way. I know that I write bad code, and then I just fix it when I see it. So, does anyone have anything else? I'm going to say a little bit more, and then if we have any more time, then we have questions, or meet up with me later and we can chat about pretty much whatever. Also, I've probably met a lot of you before, but I'm terrible at both faces and names. I do remember conversations. So if you see me later and tell me that you talked about something, I'll remember it. Anyway, let me just run through these views with kind of an interest in how many. Feedback is key. And I've been kind of, if I have any standpoint or any view that is important and has been consistent across talks, at conferences, at user groups, things like that, is that software development is a conversation, whether it's open source or whether it's what you're doing. And if you're just talking and not getting anything back, then you're living in a fantasy world. So discussions like this are what drive software forward. And think about that at every level of your development. So, if you're dealing with an abandoned software project, the easiest way to start, fix the bugs that you know are broken. Maybe you have fixes laying around. We had some in the report that we just moved up, into PDF Writer. That was something that took 0 time. We just had to make sure that when we removed those fixes from report chunk, they still work on the problems didn't reappear. This is an easy way to get started on an abandoned project. And if this is something that, say it's an internal project, just fix a couple problems and then get people using it. That's a start. And don't really worry so much about being the hero and making it, the next big thing. Start working on these new features as they become important as you have time for them. Because the key is just to make something usable again. Keep an open door for patches, because as soon as you start working on a project and people realize that it's no longer dead, you will get them. And learn as you go. I don't think it's necessary, if you're thinking of taking over projects, to know every line of the code in there. You should have a general idea, and you should be the right person to be working on it. If you're not someone who uses that stuff, you might not be. But, just kind of learn from your mistakes with the code and just kind of rapidly fix them. And I think you can go pretty far. One thing, a direct question that I have is, does anyone know of any abandoned projects in Google right now that they feel are important? Not so much, or?
Visto sometimes.
So, if you go to Ruby Forge and look at the projects up there, a lot of the stuff have never moved from we got halfway there. I think something like 80% of the projects or 70% of the projects have halted development. And this is true across all open source software. There's one that I would throw out there that's Ruby DBI. A lot of us are working with ORM, principally active record, but there still is use for a direct interface over your database in that case. And SQL comes pretty close, but it's not quite the low-level thing that we're looking for. And DBI's been dead, and it's been buggy, and Report has patches to fix that too. And if someone took that project up, it would make me very happy. And also, you guys are talking about a hack list. if you guys realize that some of you are dealing with a project that, people are either unresponsive or have disappeared, think about maybe adopting that. It's kind of an ideal situation, right? Because you can just once a month or once every couple of months fix a few bugs that are on the tracker and then just put a release out there. With enough eyes, that would be very easy. It's a simple thing to do. And you don't need to invest too much time to do that. This is some information, maybe hard to you can Google all of this stuff probably. But anyway, there's a track. It's self-hosted, hosted by svnrepository.com, which if you guys want one-click track installs, it's like, I think I pay like $6 a month for unlimited track installs, and it's well worth it. I use it for all my projects. And then I use it for my commercial stuff too, because they do, HTTPS and some security stuff and things like that. There's my personal blog, which is metta.blogspot.com. It's mostly not Ruby stuff, so unless you're interested in hearing me rant about things like Go and Buddhism, there is some Ruby in there, math, Happy Meal toys, random stuff like that. You may not be interested in that. But then there's also the report book. And if you guys are doing business reporting and in Ruby or Rails, and you're interested in that, we're pretty much most of the way done with this book. We're probably 85% of the way done with the book. We've broken up pretty others. So that's a shameless plug. It's completely unrelated to this time. But I figured I'd throw it in there anyway. And that's pretty much it. So, thank you. Is there any more questions before I kind of?
Just if you had any comments on maintaining momentum. You have an abandoned project, you take it up. How do you keep it from becoming abandoned again?
That's a good question. That happened to DBI. It was like we took PDF Writer officially RubyConf this year. DBI got taken RubyConf in 2005. They got one maintenance release out, and then they abandoned it. I don't know, I think it's one of those things where if you want to keep the project, be able to stay with it for at least long enough, there's someone else will be able to pick up where you left that. We stated that we're not aiming to make the next big thing with PDF Writer at all. We're fixing bugs, we're applying patches when people need it. We're basically glorified janitors, and that's not a big commitment for us, especially because we use it every day. But yeah, don't take on a project that you can't do. It's not quite a disservice. It's not that, if you get only this out of totally nothing. I mean, the way to keep momentum up is to keep working on the project. It's really no other way around it.
I guess it would be easier if it were important to you in some aspect of whatever it is you do.
And I mean, that's one of the things that could help you in deciding whether or not you're the right person to take over. If you are ready to de facto own a project, if you have to fix bugs in your own code, fix bugs from another library in your own code, and there's no recourse for you to get those fixed in the original stuff, and then when you see people complaining about these bugs, you say, hey, I know you don't really have reporting stuff that you need to do, but why don't you just like instantiate a PDF format or if you report it, you can actually proxy back to the PDF writer thing and get our bug fixes. Then we already own the project, if you're doing that, then you might be a good candidate, and there's no need to worry about momentum. You're just, taking the responsibility and doing it honestly. So, is that? I was confident asking, are they doing that beer thing tonight? my introduction, I almost tried to do like an introduction because I never talk about, what projects I'm working on, who I am, all of that stuff. But I tried to make one, but it ended up having like 4 slides about beer, which was kind of strange. That's why I set it up. Are people meeting up afterwards?
Yeah.
So where you guys going, John Hopper?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so maybe I'll see some of you later. Okay. Thanks for having me.